Just as millions of Americans will be eyeing the result of their presidential election, so too will world leaders. Nowhere more so than in Europe, where the result will shape politics on this side of the Atlantic for the next 4 years or more. And a warm welcome to the programme from me, David Foster. Of course, it's not just politicians watching on with interest, but businesses, military leaders, everybody with a stake in how the US conducts itself. So how will the natures, the policies of Donald Trump and Joe Biden dictate what happens next on the European continent? The US election result will have direct consequences in Europe. And some analysts fear that if President Trump is re-elected, he may weaken American guarantees to NATO allies, undermine political agreements, and maybe even start a trade war with Europe, as he's previously threatened to do. While a victory for Democrat candidate Joe Biden could renew abandoned commitments to multilateralism. And so while Trump touts America first, Joe Biden is wary of America alone, and Europe waits with collective bated breath. Okay, let's get talking about what the last 4 years have brought us, what the next 4 years might bring us. We welcome Poast, who's from the Department of Political Science at the University of Chicago. We welcome once again Pieter Cleppe. He's in Brussels, and he's from the Property Rights Alliance. And we go to Berlin next to say hi to Nicolas Bouchet, who's from the German Marshall Fund of the United States, specializing in democracy promotion and relations between the United States, the EU, and Russia. Great to have you all on the program. Nick, let's come to you first of all. 2016, and it was described as a massive shock for Europe when President Trump came in. Have the last 4 years lessened that shock in any way?
No, first of all, thank you for having me. I think actually the last 4 years have made that shock much more palpable and real, and maybe even in many ways more than was expected in many different ways.
In what way?
Well, I think fundamentally Europe has been used for decades with a United States that was both providing a security shell that was providing protection in many ways for the European countries, and also providing security around the periphery of Europe. And also behind that shell, or within that shelf, there was always a United States that was supporting and encouraging different ways of European integration. And the last 4 years on both of these records, on both of these dimensions, the Trump administration, and Trump specifically, has weakened those two dimensions considerably.
Weakened in what sense? Because I was going to say the perception is that he's been fairly brutal when it comes to talking about security within Europe, and yet NATO still exists. American troops, despite Donald Trump's threat, are still in Europe. In what way has it actually been weakened?
Well, I think it's been weakened because ultimately it's about a relationship of trust and of knowing what the future will bring in the relationship, that you can rely on each other. So it's not necessarily always what is being done or what has been done, but it's in a certain degree of confidence that when you need something from your allies, and the United States and European countries have been allies much more than partners or friends, it's knowing that when the time comes, you can actually rely on your allies to turn up and deliver for what you've both agreed on. And I think the last 4 years have put a great degree of doubt within Europe that this is not necessarily something that they can rely on to the extent that they'd had over the previous 60 or 70 years.
Okay, Peter, let me come to you first of all, and then Paul, I will ask for the opinion from the United States about this. Can we no longer rely on the United States if we are Europeans, as suggested?
I think we can still rely on the United States. Of course, it's true that Trump has openly questioned, for example, that the United States would come to the defense of the Baltic countries. So I think you can make a case indeed, like the previous speaker has done, that Trump is not good in this regard. On the other hand, he has sort of shaking up European countries that you could say are a little bit complacent. If you look at their defense spending, which is, of course, a very imperfect metric, but he has definitely convinced them to spend more on defense. I would personally like them to spend more on defense capacity, which does not necessarily mean increasing the absolute defense spending figures. On top of that, Donald Trump has also increased the number of troops in Poland. So there was a lot of attention for pulling out troops of Germany. But actually, if you think about it, if you consider Russia as a threat, and you can definitely make that case, I would say it's very important that you have American troops in Poland rather than in Germany.
I think we'll talk about Russia in just a moment on its own with regards to the United States. But I want to ask you about the suggestion that another 4 years of Donald Trump in the White House, and it could see the dismantling of NATO.
I don't think Donald Trump is the threat here, or the United States. I would say there's other factors lacking commitment in Western Europe, thinking about Benelux, Germany, that has been going on for decades when it comes to defense. France and the United Kingdom have been better in that regard, but even there, a lot of progress needs to be made. Now, of course, on the longer term, it's true that even under Obama, you already had the pivot to Asia. It was sort of unavoidable that given the increased economic importance of Asia, that the United States would turn more of its attention there. So, I mean, in a nutshell, I think the Europeans have it in their own hands, whether they want to keep the United States as a partner for defense or not. And I think that really goes beyond Trump.
Yeah, let's go to Paul in Chicago. And the perception is that European security is not as reliant, if it wants to be, on the United States as it used to be. Do you think that really is the case? And if it is Joe Biden, would that change?
So first of all, thank you for having me on the show. And secondly, let's be honest, when it comes to foreign policy in general with the United States, with the American public, it's not the first priority. Having said that, this election is definitely a referendum on the America First policy. However, I think a lot of what was just said is true, which is that for all of the bluster, and there's no doubt that if Joe Biden was elected, there would be a change in tone. You wouldn't have all caps tweets coming out complaining about German spending, for example. But beyond the rhetoric and even the perception, I'm not sure how much would actually change. And the major reason why has very little to do with Donald Trump, has very little to do with the Western Europeans or the Eastern European countries that are members of NATO, has a lot to do with Russia, has a lot to do with China. That when it comes to institutions like NATO and some of the other international institutions that these countries, along with the US, are members, the main thing that holds them together a lot of times is a threat, is someone that we're banding together to counter somebody. And we indeed heard over the summer Secretary of State Pompeo talk about forming an alliance of democracies. And he mentioned NATO as part of this. He mentioned the G7 as part of this. But he also brought in, of course, East Asian countries as well, because the main threat here was China. But there's no doubt that Russia also remains a threat. And that would be the case whether it's Biden or Trump.
Let's talk about Russia. China's geographically outside of Europe, but there are effects within Europe, obviously. But I want to talk about Donald Trump's attitude towards Vladimir Putin. Yes, sanctions have been imposed on Russia, yet it is said that he's fairly lax with the Russian leader, that he tolerates an awful lot that many other people would not do. And that is of a concern to the European leaders, it is claimed. Is that actually the case in your opinion?
Well, Donald Trump wouldn't be the first leader to want to have a strong relationship, personal relationship with Vladimir Putin. We can all recall George W. Bush talking about how he looked into Putin's eyes and saw his soul. So this is Trump's desire to have a close relationship with Putin is not unusual in that regard. However, with both Bush and with Trump, to the point you just raised, the actual policies don't point towards a friendly relationship. Whether it is strengthening the eastern flank of NATO, whether it is continuing to support Ukraine against Russia's actions there, whether it is lending support to certain pro-democracy movements throughout what would be called the near abroad, and that Russia views as its sphere of influence. These are all policies that the U.S. has continued going to cyber attacks. Under the Trump administration, U.S. cyber attacks against Russia has actually increased. And so all of this goes against the perception, despite Trump's actions and words, of U.S. and Russian relations actually becoming more friendly.
Okay, can we talk about trade now? We've sort of covered security, although they do interlock in many ways. And Peter, let me come to you first of all. Is the perception that the United States will always want to have the upper hand in trade negotiations? And it's talked about renegotiating with Europe backwards, forwards, steel tariffs, aluminium tariffs, etc., etc. Do you think that will change in the next 4 years? First, if it is Donald Trump, and secondly, if it is Joe Biden?
I do think there's going to be a change, whether it is Biden or Trump. Now, I would say in general, Trump, he barks, but he doesn't really bite. If you look at, for example, NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, that was renegotiated by Trump, but the updated NAFTA did not really differ all that much from the one that was in place. It was still it kept all the tariff reductions in place. It even opened up some markets, so actually not that bad. Before Trump, it was very hard to already get to an agreement between the U.S. and Europe and the EU, simply because both sides definitely do have their protectionist instinct. If you look at China, despite all the tension, trade goes on with China, which actually I do think is a good thing. But of course, in military terms, in geostrategic terms, tensions are increasing. And I would argue Donald Trump is mainly, let's say, more vocal about what's actually going on, which is that China is changing. It's under this new...
Do you think any kind of European-US alliance against China would be stronger under Donald Trump or perhaps Joe Biden?
Well, I do think when it comes to China, it's not going to make such a big difference. I would be highly surprised if suddenly the relationship between China and the US would improve. Now, I would love it to improve. I think it's very important to get along with China, with Russia. But yeah, frankly, if there are security concerns, the only responsible policy is to voice them, to stand up for the security of the Western public. And what we can see is that European countries are actually following the United States in their skepticism
and
towards
they would do perhaps
Huawei and
whoever it actually was.
Yes.
Which brings me, Nick, to Germany. You are in Berlin. This time next year, there may well be a new chancellor. Well, there will be a new chancellor. There will be a new leader of the current governing party. Does it really matter who that is and who sits in the White House as to relationships between Germany and the United States?
I think who sits in the White House matters greatly, especially after the last 4 years, because in many ways, I think Germany has been possibly the country that has taken the hardest the changes in tone and to some degree in the content of US policy under Trump. This has really challenged some very fundamental assumptions about the transatlantic relationship, about the German-American relationship in security and in economics. And it's been very hard, I think, for the whole German policy class to adapt to this. Now, just to go back to my earlier point, I don't mean to say that everything that's happened in the last 4 years that was bad in terms of or challenging in terms of the transatlantic relationship was down to Trump. I think clearly there were trends both on the security front and on the economics front that predate Trump, and his style and his beliefs have basically turbocharged that. And the way he has pursued that in the last 4 years has provoked some good reactions on defense spending, on Europe standing on its own 2 feet or thinking that it has to stand on its own 2 feet more. Having said that, the way that Trump himself personally and some of his more like-minded advisors have gone about this, both in the relationships towards Germany and towards Europe as a whole, has been at least as counterproductive as productive. And since you talk about China, I think that's probably going to be the major issue going forward. I think it's quite right. I think there is a consensus now in Washington and in the US that China is a problem and that there has to be a much more confrontational or more solid approach towards China. I wouldn't like to use the term alliance against China, but clearly there is this impulse coming from America, and this has put the focus on Europe and Germany, which has a very strong economic relationship with China, to actually rethink where it stands and how it deals with this. What matters, I think, is that the Trump administration in many ways has been doing this in a style, and style does matter, which basically makes it more difficult for a country like Germany or for most European countries to come on board on a common China policy, which the US and Europe will need, because I think looking ahead for the next 2, 3, 4 decades, it seems pretty clear that neither of them really want to challenge or to engage with China on their own, because the balance of power would not be necessarily so favorable.
Can I ask you about Russia, since it's one of your areas of expertise, European, United States and Russia relations? Do you think the Russians and the Germans understand that what Donald Trump is doing, as suggested by Paul Poast, is perhaps simply stating, look, there's one side of this which is business, and there's one side of this which is a personal relationship? Or do the Europeans perhaps feel that Russia's being allowed to get away with too much in terms of cyber attacks and military adventurism, et cetera, et cetera?
Well, I think it's been true, actually, that although Trump specifically has a certain softness or a certain predisposition to not taking on Russia and Putin, there is on Russia in Washington a very strong consensus, and that has not been shifted so much that we've seen by Trump himself. I think another 4 years of Trump would put him in a position to maybe try and challenge that consensus more. I'm not sure that he necessarily wants to at this point. I think also it depends who you speak to. I think I speak to a lot of colleagues and friends and partners in Eastern Europe, and you get a fairly apprehensive picture, because they feel that at the top of the decision-making tree in Washington is someone that really doesn't mind what Russia does in Eastern Europe and in its neighborhood.
Let me go to Paul and ask you about different policies. In terms of, I mentioned military adventurism, which is what leads me to ask this question. I asked it when it came to Russia. Now let's talk about the United States. Go back to President Obama, go back to Bush 2, and you've got forays into Iraq, Afghanistan, into Libya. Donald Trump has pulled back from that considerably. Was that a relief, do you think, to his European allies? Because, of course, the knock-on effects of those conflicts could be felt all the way across the European continent.
I think the perception here in the United States is that you're exactly right. Trump came in with a desire to not engage in new conflicts, using military power for democracy promotion, all the hallmarks that we saw of the Bush administration. However, both through his administration and then also if you look at the Obama administration, there's been this inability to fully disengage from Afghanistan and Iraq and now Syria. And so this is one of the big reasons that people point to the phrase the blob, right? They point to this foreign policy establishment in Washington that seems to perpetuate certain policies. And one of these policies that is the policy that leads to what people call these endless wars in Afghanistan, in Iraq, Syria, etc. And so there's real concern that though Trump has shifted some troops around, though Trump has withdrawn some troops, just like Obama did, he hasn't been able to fully disengage. And there's concerns that even with another term, Trump's still not going to be able to fully disengage from these conflicts.
But would Joe Biden be any different? I'm so sorry, I preempted you.
Yeah.
Biden wouldn't be any different.
Yeah, I don't know if Biden would either, because Biden was there for 8 years under Obama. And keep in mind, Biden is someone who has a very long track record when it comes to U.S. foreign policy and the U.S. foreign policy establishment. He was a longtime senator. Part of the reason why he was made vice president by Obama was because of his foreign policy expertise. So it's not like he would bring a completely different way of thinking into the equation. And so for me, much like how I would view relations, U.S. relations vis-a-vis Russia and China to not be much different under Trump or Biden, I also wouldn't view U.S. policies vis-a-vis Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria to be much different between Biden or Trump.
Okay, the sands of time are running out for us, so we're going to move on to climate change. And since we're talking about Europe, let's call it the Paris Climate Accords, which Donald Trump withdrew from Joe Biden, Paul would go straight back in with those, and that might be a relief to his European allies who are pushing for a cleaner world.
That's right. That I think this is something that I would call some of the low-hanging fruit. I think you could put the Paris Agreement, the Iran deal. These are executive agreements, and so what that means is it doesn't require the Senate to ratify, and these are things that Biden could immediately go back into. What I think people are hoping for is that if Biden is elected, that it won't just be going back into the Paris Agreement, because the Paris Agreement didn't really obligate states to do a whole lot. That was part of the criticism of Trump leaving it, is they said, well, that's fine, you're leaving it, but it didn't actually, it's more symbolic that you're leaving it because it didn't actually obligate anybody to do anything. And so I think...
Okay, so can I throw that now to our two guests in European cities? Peter, you first of all, is it entirely symbolic if the United States rejoins the Paris Climate Accord?
Well, no, because what Donald Trump had done is really to indeed leave that accord because of his opposition to political globalism. Now, the United States is actually managing to reduce its CO2 emissions, but it's using innovation to achieve that, not some kind of a top-down planned economic agenda. So indeed, Biden, I would suspect, will be quite different from Trump. He does support political globalism. Now, I'm not entirely sure that Trump should be criticized for his opposition, because if you look at the United Nations, you see in the Human Rights Committee all kinds of countries that violate human rights, in the Women's Rights Committee, countries that violate women's rights. You see the WHO, which completely mismanaged COVID, which refused to listen to Taiwan because of its ties to China, even if Taiwan had an
I wish we had
successful
time for the entire world as it's been affected by Donald Trump, but we are trying to concentrate here on Europe. So thanks for your thoughts on the climate change agreement. Nick, let me come to you, and you could write entire papers on this. Perhaps you already have. Next 4 years, better for Europe, Donald Trump or Joe Biden?
Oh, I think undoubtedly Biden. I think it doesn't mean that we will go back to some idyllic past that never really existed, but I think it would be a return to some kind of normality in the relationship. And after the last 12 months and the last 4 years, I think a bit of normality would not be a bad thing for everybody concerned.
And if you could pick the 1, 2, 3 in terms of importance areas that we will see massive change in if it is a different president in the White House, what would they be?
In terms of change, I think certainly there would be a better situation regarding trade. I think there would be a better situation regarding Russia and Eastern Europe. And I think there would be a better situation regarding the question of the US engagement as a multilateral player around the world rather than go it alone and confrontational player.
But Paul, as it turns out, as you say, America First is a policy that concentrates entirely on the homeland and not the wider world. As far as Europe is concerned, do the American public seem to care very much what will or won't change?
I think the American public, going back to what I said at the beginning, the American public is primarily focused at home. COVID is obviously a major issue on people's minds, whether they want to follow certain restrictions or not in terms of mask wearing. It's still on their minds. And so these are the issues that really drive the American public. However, I think one foreign policy issue that affects a lot of Americans think about and has a direct impact on Europe is immigration policy. And that is something where I do think you would see a major change between if we go to a Biden administration. There's huge differences between Biden and Trump in terms of visas, in terms of work permits, student visas, let alone talking about issues such as wall building and illegal immigration. And that is something that is very relevant to a lot of Europeans.
Okay, listen, thanks very much indeed. Of course, one of the areas that we've not been able to go into in depth at the moment is the United Kingdom's relationship with whoever is in the White House over the next few years, considering that pretty soon we are no longer going to be talking about trade deals with Europe. Well, who knows? But trade deals with the United States, again, who knows? And Joe Biden it's been suggested that Joe Biden might not be quite as cozy with Boris Johnson, assuming that he is still Prime Minister Johnson as his predecessor, if that is Donald Trump. I hope I'm not getting too confusing, has been over the last few years. So it's a delicate balancing act for the United Kingdom and for whoever comes into the White House. Listen, sorry for that little bit of a monologue at the end. I had enough time to fill, and we hadn't talked about the United Kingdom, and I didn't think it was time for us to go into it in depth since we were running out of time, which is precisely what we have done now. Thank you all very much indeed for taking part in the conversation. From me, David Foster, from the Roundtable team. Thank you for watching it wherever you happen to have done so. We hope to have your company next time, by which time, who knows who's going to be in the White House. Bye-bye.